Living in a 19th-century English ducal mansion meant inhabiting a world built upon layers. Layers of luxury, layers of tradition, layers of invisible labor that sustained the superficial brilliance of the aristocracy. It was a complex social microcosm, almost a small country, with its own laws, its own rhythms, and a hierarchy as rigid as that of any European court. Each morning, each meal, each party, each official visit, each decision by the Duke, each movement of the Duchess, each step echoing through the long stone corridors, was sustained by a meticulously organized human machinery. The ducal mansion was not merely a residence, it was a universe. The vast lawns, the cultivated woods, the greenhouses of exotic plants, the artificial lakes, the stable and carriage houses, everything seemed to exist to reflect the grandeur and power accumulated over generations. In the 19th century, when the British Empire was expanding its influence across the world, being a duke meant being part of an elite that saw itself as guardian not only of the land, but of English history itself. The main house was a monumental construction of light stone, with neoclassical columns, tall windows, and a calculated symmetry designed to inspire respect. Ballrooms, portrait galleries, immense libraries, and drawing rooms decorated with French tapestries coexisted with secret passages, narrow corridors, and staircases reserved exclusively for servants, ensuring that the essential work of the house was executed without ever disturbing the nobility. It was backstage where life truly thrived. The ducal mansion was powered by a numerous, disciplined, and invisible workforce whose routine began before sunrise. The hierarchy was rigid. Butler, supreme authority among the servants, responsible for finances, provisions, and general household control. Housekeeper, absolute commander of the maids, guardian of clothing, cleanliness, and female staff behavior. Liveried footman, responsible for serving at table, attending guests, and visually representing the Duke's prestige. Cooks and assistants, installed in bustling kitchens where cauldrons, heavy pans, and enormous stoves dominated the environment. Chambermaids, tasked with keeping rooms impeccable, extinguishing candles, replacing linens, polishing furniture, and, above all, never being seen. Gardeners, organizers of every flower, every orchard, every outdoor ceremony. Coachmen, grooms, and handlers cared for the horses, status symbols as important as titles. Hallway servants and messengers circulated through the house like shadows. Each one knew exactly where to step, when to speak, and when to disappear. There were rules. A servant must never look directly into a duke's eyes. A chambermaid must never be found in the same room as a guest. No piece of silver may show the slightest sign of tarnish. Before the Duke and Duchess awakened, the house was already in full operation. Chimneys were lit one by one. Breakfast began to be prepared, letters were sorted, horses were groomed, heavy carpets were beaten. Corridors were polished. Water heated for baths was carried in giant basins. The housekeeper walked through the house with firm steps, checking that each room was arranged to the family's standards. The butler, in turn, was already reviewing accounts, stocks, and the day's menu with the French chef, an almost obligatory luxury among English nobles. The Duke and Duchess began the day without hearing this commotion. For them, the house always presented itself ready, as if by magic. Morning tea appeared effortlessly. Newspapers were perfectly folded, clothes appropriately selected, the garden immaculate. During the 19th century, the daily life of an English duke consisted of social commitments, politics, estate administration, and, of course, leisure. Fox hunts, horseback rides, dinners with other nobles, visits to court in London, and long seasons hosting guests were part of his routine. Time seemed to run differently. Privilege created an existence that isolated them from common reality. The Duchess managed the social household, supervising menus, guest lists, party preparations, the demands of long-term visitors, and the infinite details of ceremonies and balls. Her role was to be the living embodiment of aristocratic grace, a position that required political skill and precise control of her own image. Receiving guests was one of the pillars of aristocratic life, and it wasn't about welcoming one or two people. Sometimes 20, 40, 50 guests would stay for weeks. These visitors expected absolute comfort, rooms prepared with fresh flowers, clothes discreetly laundered by chambermaids, abundant and constant meals, daily entertainment. For the ducal family, it was a way to reinforce alliances, nurture political relationships, foster strategic marriages, and display the splendor of the property. For the servants, it was a period of total exhaustion. Each guest generated a chain of responsibilities: clothes to iron, meals to serve, rooms to heat, tables to rearrange, carriages to prepare, gardens to adapt for morning walks. But nothing compared to the great parties. The ducal mansion was the stage for balls capable of mobilizing the entire region. Preparations began weeks in advance, the chef planning menus of 30 courses, servants polishing hundreds of pieces of silver and crystal, gardeners assembling giant arrangements, maids reorganizing extra rooms, musicians rehearsing in echoing halls, seamstresses adjusting dresses for the duchess, the butler coordinating schedules, invitations, accommodations, guest flow and transportation. On the night of the ball, the house was transformed. Chandeliers illuminated the hall with golden brilliance. The orchestra filled the air with Viennese waltzes. Silk and taffeta dresses moved like colorful waves. Silver reflected the candlelight. The laden tables displayed exquisite dishes, French wines, elaborate desserts with ingredients brought from the colonies. Guests danced, conversed, formed political and romantic alliances, while dozens of servants moved silently through the shadows, ensuring that every detail remained impeccable. Despite the grandeur surrounding aristocratic life, living in a ducal mansion in the 19th century also meant facing a world in slow transformation. The luxurious routine, the calculated gestures, the constant ceremony, and the silent power that enveloped the English nobility coexisted with social, economic, and political pressures that heralded a future in which that lifestyle would be called into question. Behind the public pomp, the intimate life of dukes was carefully separated from the eyes of servants and visitors. There were wings reserved for the family, private apartments with smaller sitting rooms, more discreet fireplaces, personal collections of books and cherished objects. Here, far from the formalism of the ballroom, they could act more casually, converse in low voices about their concerns, plan trips, discuss their children's marriages, or comment on the course of politics. Still, even in these spaces, the presence of servants was inevitable. Silent chambermaids leaving hot water for baths, valets preparing clothes for the next day, trusted servants bringing important correspondence. Complete privacy was practically non-existent, but for the aristocracy, this had always been the norm. The duke's children grew up surrounded by expectations. The firstborn, future heir to the title, was educated from an early age to manage properties, represent the family in parliament, and maintain alliances with other noble houses. Education included English history, etiquette and diplomacy, horseback riding, fencing, reading Latin and Greek, politics and agrarian laws, notions of economics and administration. The daughters, on the other hand, received training focused on social life, music, singing, dance, languages, embroidery, and above all, etiquette. They were expected to make advantageous marriages capable of strengthening the family's influence. Meanwhile, below the main stairs and behind discreet doors, the servants lived completely different lives. They formed their own community, with traditions, deep friendships, and even hidden romances. The lodgings were simple, often cold and cramped, a huge contrast to the luxurious quarters of the ducal family. Still, there was a sense of belonging, almost of pride, in serving such an important house. The housekeeper had her own sitting room, where she kept account books, fabric catalogues, and the keys to the house, a symbol of her authority. The butler, in turn, enjoyed absolute respect on the servants' floor. He maintained a meticulous notebook, recording each wine entry, each piece of silver, each kitchen expense, and each official visiting hour. The younger servants aspired to rise in the hierarchy, moving from assistants to liveried servants, or even personal valets, positions that offered better pay and prestige. Throughout the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution advanced across the entire United Kingdom, bringing profound changes. Factories emerged, cities grew rapidly, new classes of merchants and industrialists prospered. With this, the aristocracy was no longer the sole holder of economic power. Some dukes adapted well to this scenario, investing in railroads, mines, textile industries, or steel mills. Others, stuck in traditions and excessive spending, began to face financial difficulties. At the same time, the demand for large teams of servants began to decline. Mechanization allowed more efficient stoves, reducing the need for assistants, sewing machines accelerating domestic work, gas lighting facilitating nighttime tasks, hydraulic systems reducing the effort of carrying water. Even so, until the final decades of the 19th century, ducal mansions still maintained more than 40, 50, or even 100 servants, a sign of status and continuity. A new social group emerged with force, the affluent middle class. They were bankers, industrialists, shipowners, international merchants, railway entrepreneurs. Many had more money than old noble families, and they wanted, above all, to insert themselves into the aristocratic circle. Marriages between young people from impoverished noble houses and daughters of millionaire industrialists became increasingly common. The nobility offered titles and tradition. The nouveau riche offered capital. In ducal mansions, this change was perceived in guest lists, consumption patterns, and especially in the family's internal discussions, not always favorable to these new alliances. Participating in aristocratic life meant respecting rigid rules of behavior. Each gesture had a meaning. Each phrase had to be carefully chosen. In a ducal mansion, social norms determined how to greet each person, who had the right to enter which room, the order of arrival and departure of guests, which topics were appropriate for conversation, the correct way to sit, dance, walk, and dress. During a formal dinner, for example, each piece of cutlery had a specific function, each course followed a determined order, and wine was served in a choreographed manner by the servants. Any deviation was noticed, commented upon, and remembered, sometimes for years. Reputation was the social axis of the aristocracy. A public slip, a scandal, a moral failure, a poorly placed comment, everything could lead to gossip and, in serious cases, ostracism. Victorian England was marked by rigid morality, and ducal families needed to maintain an irreproachable image. Therefore, preparation for events was not limited to practical aspects. The Duchess instructed sons and daughters on how to behave, the Duke evaluated speeches and postures, and servants were instructed to act as silent guardians of the social order. Upon crossing the threshold of the great halls of a 19th-century ducal mansion, one immediately perceived the symbolic force of that space. They were not merely grand chambers, they were social theatres, carefully prepared to convey power, tradition, and elegance. Their alliances were formed, marriages sealed, imperial policies discussed, and, discreetly, tensions and secrets were also created that would never reach public knowledge. The ballroom was, without doubt, the social heart of the mansion. Impressively high ceilings, gilded moldings, historical paintings, heavy silk curtains, and floors that gleamed in the light of chandeliers composed the scene. When the orchestra began to play, the environment transformed into its own universe, where music guided the rhythm of conversations and glances. The entire house worked for these moments. For the ducal family, they were decisive occasions to reinforce social positions. For the guests, they were opportunities for advancement, romance, or influence. For the servants, they were silent marathons that demanded absolute discipline. Each entrance of guests was calculated. The master of ceremonies announced names, titles, and family relations, while the butler discreetly coordinated the flow, ensuring that everyone received adequate attention. No ducal mansion escaped intrigue. The walls echoed furtive conversations, carefully planned encounters, and rivalries hidden beneath polite smiles. A prolonged glance during a waltz could generate rumors for weeks. A discreet exit to the gardens by moonlight could compromise reputations. Forbidden romances flourished in the gaps of etiquette. Sons of the aristocracy attracted to artists or private tutors. Dukes' daughters exchanging secret letters with young officers without fortune. Servants who witnessed compromising secrets but never dared to speak. Impossible loves between nobles and servants, stories that, if discovered, could ruin entire lives. Intrigues were as much a part of aristocratic life as parties, and in a way they were the invisible force that moved alliances, decisions, and hushed scandals. Beyond the balls, another fundamental event in noble life was the fox hunt, a ritual that marked status and skill. The season gathered nobles from various regions of England, all mounted on horses, carefully bred and trained for months. For the ducal mansion, the season meant hosting dozens of guests for days, preparing supplementary horses, organizing meals for large groups, providing comfort and entertainment for all. It was a moment of public demonstration of the property's power. Vast, well-tended fields, planned forests and perfect trails formed the ideal setting. For young aristocrats, the hunt was also a way to demonstrate courage and, in many cases, compete for the attention of potential suitors. Although country life was fundamental, the English nobility also followed the capital's social calendar. Every year, ducal families spent months in London to participate in high society, attending operas, court balls, political receptions, debates in Parliament, exclusive dinners at private clubs. These seasons were expensive and required a team of servants designated to accompany the family. The ducal mansion remained active even during these absences, maintained by reduced groups of servants who tended the gardens, protected precious possessions, and ensured the house was ready for the owner's triumphant return. As the century advanced into its final decades, the aristocratic world faced winds of transformation. The maintenance of large estates became increasingly difficult. Rising taxes, new legislation on land, and the gradual reduction of agricultural profits weakened previously unshakable fortunes. The mansions began to feel the weight of these changes. Some families sold art collections to pay debts. Others leased parts of their lands to industrial entrepreneurs. Some, more desperate, opened their houses to public visits, charging admission. The arrival of electricity, the telephone, and other technologies also modified the structure of houses, reducing the need for so many servants and altering the way nobles lived. The traditional system of dozens of servants began to disappear. Young people from the working class preferred factory jobs, with more regular wages and less exhausting routines. Many former servants saw their functions disappear with modernization. The housekeeper no longer commanded a battalion of chambermaids. The butler had fewer functions, as the house no longer received so many guests. Previously bustling kitchens became silent. The contrast was evident. Previously busy corridors seemed empty. Wings of the house remained closed to save expenses. Sumptuous parties became increasingly rare. The splendor of the past did not disappear completely, but lost intensity. Even facing this slow decline, many ducal families maintained a firm attachment to tradition. They continued to promote balls, albeit smaller ones, insisted on preserving clothing, crystal glasses, coats of arms, portraits of ancestors, and all the ancestral ceremonial. The ducal mansion, even when marked by financial difficulties, remained a symbol of English history, of the continuity of lineage, of the aristocracy's role in the country's cultural and political formation. There was pride, nostalgia, and, above all, awareness that this way of life was entering history, even while still being lived. At the end of the 19th century, walking through a ducal mansion was like crossing two eras at the same time. On one side, the brilliance of the halls was maintained, the impeccable furniture, the family ceremonies, the formal dinners, and the etiquette. On the other, one perceived closed rooms, less tended gardens, scarcer servants, old fabrics beginning to lose color, a subtle atmosphere of melancholy. It was as if the walls carried too many memories, and the present was merely a shadow of the splendor of previous decades. As the 19th century drew to a close, the great ducal mansions became not only aristocratic residences, but living monuments to a way of life that was beginning to disappear. Their enormous halls, the carefully designed gardens, the corridors where dozens of servants once circulated in silence, all of this acquired an almost symbolic tone, as if each stone carried memories of an England that was slowly moving away from the past. These properties were not just luxurious houses, they were the materialization of centuries of history. They contained portraits of ancestors who had fought in wars, governed counties, influenced Parliament. They kept archives, letters, maps, and documents that narrated the family's trajectory. They preserved traditions dating back to medieval times. They displayed art collections accumulated generation after generation. When walking through their galleries, it was impossible not to feel the weight of lineage. Everything, from the way furniture was arranged to the annual ceremonies celebrated in the chapel, had been shaped by centuries of continuity. The mansion was, above all, a symbol of aristocratic England, with its rights, its hierarchies, and its particular vision of social order. However, modernity penetrated these centuries-old walls, initially timidly, but then inevitably. The installation of electric lighting, for example, profoundly altered the house's routine. It reduced the work of servants responsible for candles, modified the atmosphere of the halls, and broke the intimate relationship that the aristocracy maintained with the glow of flames and the reflection of shadows. The arrival of the telephone also transformed communication. The Duke no longer depended exclusively on messengers or letters. Business was discussed more quickly, invitations could be confirmed rapidly, and new forms of sociability began to emerge. Modernity, however, came accompanied by challenges. Maintaining a mansion of this size became too expensive. Hydraulic and electrical systems required specialized maintenance. Structural renovations were essential but extremely costly. English society was changing, and with it the role of the nobility. The 19th century was also a period of questioning of old structures. Intellectuals, politicians, journalists, and members of the affluent middle class began to discuss the relevance of titles, hereditary privileges, and the aristocratic way of life. The mansions, previously seen as centers of power, came to be seen by some as symbols of inequality. The aristocracy responded with elegance and resistance, promoting increasingly elaborate parties, maintaining ancestral traditions, preserving ceremonial pomp, reinforcing the historical importance of their houses. But the decline could not be stopped with beautiful ceremonies alone. The cost of modernity was high, and many families realized they needed to adapt or lose what they had. Still, there were moments of great beauty. At night, when guests had already retired and the house fell silent, the mansion acquired another character. Crackling fireplaces, shadows of candelabras dancing on the walls, distant sounds of the last servant's footsteps, an almost magical atmosphere took over the environment. The Duke and Duchess sat in their private halls. She wrote letters or reviewed social lists. He read newspapers or discussed county affairs with his private secretary. Older children, if they were at home, played piano or read novels of the era. Daughters conversed about fashion, marriage, travels, or simply awaited the next social season when they could dazzle at London balls. This was the intimate side of aristocratic life, less grand, more human. Over the years, many of these great halls began to remain empty frequently. The number of servants decreased. The ducal family traveled more to London or abroad. The costs of maintaining the property in perfect condition increased. There was a particular melancholy in crossing an empty ballroom. The silenced music echoed in memory. The chandeliers hung like silent witnesses to past glories. The floor, once marked by the gliding of dozens of dancing couples, now remained impeccable, but solitary. In some mansions, this emptiness was so striking that it generated stories. Rumors of spirits of former servants, reports of footsteps during the night, echoes of non-existent conversations, memories embodied in the walls. It was not supernatural. It was accumulated history. Despite the decline, the legacy of these properties resisted time. Some were transformed into museums, others into luxury hotels, and many continue to be inhabited by descendants of the original families, still trying to preserve traditions dating back centuries. These mansions became an essential part of British identity. They represent historical continuity, the aesthetics of the Victorian period, the art of aristocratic hospitality, the symbolic role of nobility in the country's cultural construction. Visiting a ducal mansion today is to experience an encounter with the past. It is to see the halls where balls took place, imagine the servants running through secret corridors, feel the presence of generations who lived there under strict rules, and an almost religious sense of tradition. Living in a 19th century ducal mansion meant inhabiting a world where everything was carefully choreographed. Each gesture, each sound, each meal, each party was part of a great social performance. Aristocratic life was, at the same time, luxurious and oppressive, beautiful and lonely, full of power and surrounded by obligations, immersed in tradition but threatened by modernity. Those who lived there existed between splendor and shadow, between history and the future, between authority and duty. The ducal mansions were ultimately private cities, full of life, work, intrigue, passions, and secrets, social monuments that profoundly marked the 19th century and continue even today to inspire fascination.